listeners, and welcome to episode 1 of Mind in Motion, where we will be talking about the neurology of sleep, specifically in teenagers. Today, I'm thrilled to welcome Professor Amy Wolfson from Loyola University, Maryland, a clinical psychologist whose work on teen sleep, school start times, and sleep education has shaped how schools and families make real changes. She's co-authored the American Academy of Pediatrics policy on school start times and has authored dozens of research papers and publications on adolescent sleep. Professor Wilson, thank you so much for being here.
Yeah, my pleasure. Well, it's pretty cool that I'm on episode 1. I didn't realize that. So, my pleasure.
Yeah. So before we get into, the mechanisms of sleep, I was wondering if you could share a little bit about, your personal path and what drew you to sleep research.
Absolutely. Absolutely happy to do that. And you're from an important city, Seattle. I'm not sure if it's your school, but Seattle public schools, a good, gosh, pre-pandemic were one of the, not the earliest, but earlier major school district in the United States to delay school start times to help adolescents get more sleep. I don't know if you realize that. So they have more what we call age-appropriate school start times. Um, yeah, a little bit about myself. I grew up and down the East Coast, and after my undergraduate years at Harvard, I went to Washington University in St. Louis, Missouri, where I got my PhD or doctorate in clinical psychology with a focus on child clinical psychology and eventually a focus on what we now call, we didn't use this word at the time, sleep psychology. And I've really devoted my entire career. So this is a long time. I have gray hair to the field of not just adolescent sleep, but adolescent sleep has been my primary focus for at least the last 25, 30 years, but children's sleep in general. I've done work on infant sleep and in fact currently do some more work now on children in foster care and some of their sleep health needs. So younger children, not just adolescents. Um, but yeah, so I've lived in a lot of different places. I after I finished my academic, undergraduate work on the East Coast, I was in St. Louis, Missouri, the Washington University there, and then went out to California and lived on the West Coast for a while doing my postdoctoral work, and then eventually returned to the East Coast. I'm married. My husband is also a psychologist, and we have one son who is in his early 30s and going to be getting married in August. So that's a little bit about me. And we have a big dog who's lying here next to me. And then I teach, in addition to doing research. I mean, one of the things that's really a huge part of my life, and I think important for your audience to hear, is I teach college students. So I do teach some graduate students, but a lot of my time is spent with 18 to 22-year-olds. And I, in fact, teach two courses this semester, two sections of a course called Sleep, Circadian Rhythms, and Behavior. That is a course in the psychology department that sophomores, juniors, and seniors take depending on their schedules. So um, I spend a lot of time thinking about sleep and teaching about sleep and so on.
Yeah, I know. Um, was there, a moment or a study that, made you think that like this is it, this will make an impact on society?
Um, well, let me back up for a second. What I'll just say is that when I was doing my graduate work many years ago, so this would be in the late 1980s. So for your audience, that's a long, long time ago. But um, I was working with a professor who's not with us anymore, and her name is Patricia Lax, and she actually was a clinical psychologist and very renowned for one of the early work on what we now call cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, CBTI. And your audience can easily look that up. And I was much more interested, as I said, in children and adolescents, and basically went to her and said, I really want to do work around parenting and infant sleep. And that's sort of what launched my interest from then on. And the field was very new then. Your audience needs to understand that it really wasn't until the middle of the 20th century, which again may seem like a long time ago, but really is not. So, say only 10, 15 years after I was born, that we really understood what REM sleep is, what non-REM sleep is, that we understood that what happens over the course of the night in sleep and what the brain does. And all of that was just burgeoning in the mid and late 20th century. And so, infant and children, child and adolescent sleep then came even after that. It wasn't until the latter, very end of the 20th century that someone who became my mentor, Mary Carskadden, really started to study developmental changes in adolescent sleep. So and then I was fortunate to spend an initial sabbatical year doing research with her in the early 1990s. And that's really what led to my collaborative work and all of the work I've been doing since then. So
Yeah.
that kind of answered your question.
Yeah, that was perfect. Yeah, I know, especially because I mean, for me, sleep is like an incredibly important part of your day. I mean, you spend a third of your life sleeping.
Mhm.
So it's so important, and um I just think it's great that we're starting to learn a lot more about it as the years go by. So speaking of, research, as I know you're aware, more than about 40 years ago, Alexander Borbet and his colleagues introduced the two-process model, which, is a simple yet powerful way to explain how sleep works. So I was wondering if you could just walk our listeners through, its core ideas.
I could. It'd be nice to if we were doing this visually because it's really important to see the
Right, yeah.
graph of explaining it. Um, but absolutely. So yes, it's a very important model, and it's a very important model with regard to really helping us to understand what adolescents face. So we have two systems is what we sort of call them, process S and process C, that they sort of developed and wrote extensively about and still written about even more recently. Process S stands for sleep pressure or a sleep homeostatic process. And what that simply means is we as humans become increasingly more sleepy, or there's more pressure to sleep the further we go from when we last slept. So my sleep pressure is building quite rapidly. For me, it's 7 o'clock on the East Coast, and I go to bed around 9:30. So my sleep pressure, this is a hard time actually to do this interview. So my sleep pressure is pretty high at this point. Um, but what also regulates how sleepy or how alert we are, because that's really what this two process model is all about at any given time in the 24-hour day, is also process C, which stands for circadian process or circadian rhythms or our biological clock. And what that's referring to, I'm going to back up a little bit to talk about that. Um, we have three clocks kind of that govern our lives. We have day night, which is our natural kind of out external clock. We have our biological clock, which is governed by our suprachiasmatic nucleus. That's literally the clock in the hypothalamus. Um, and then we also have man-made time, right? We just changed the clocks in this country from daylight savings time to standard time. Whole nother interview to talk about that. Um, but that's man-made. That's constructed. That's entirely constructed. But what process C is referring to is that biological clock. And our biological clock for most humans is a little more than 24 hours. And in this case, we're either more sleepy or more alert, not related to how when we last slept or how much sleep we've had, but where our clock is. And there are certain times in the day that we are more alert or more sleepy that are primarily related to our clock. And we can, and so let me give examples of that, and then I'll also talk about how we measure that. So, so the best way to think about it is let's take the early dawn hours. So I always say to my students, if one student in my room, one of my students, we'll just call her Sam. Let's say Sam pulled an all-nighter, didn't sleep at all, and yet had to get to the train station to catch a train at 7 in the morning or 6:30 in the morning. And let's say Jonah um, did not pull an all-nighter and slept about 8.5, 9 hours, which would be great for a 18-year-old, but also had a train to catch early in the morning. If you just thought about process S, the person who slept, Jonah, should be wake up and be alert and able to go get that train in the early dawn hours. But interestingly enough, um, the clock is still sort of not ready to wake up in the early dawn hours. And so it's dangerous to drive yourself or to have anyone drive you, say, in those early dawn hours. And it's going to vary by the individual a little bit, but in those very, very early morning hours, whether you slept or you didn't sleep, because where the clock is at that point, alerting is very low. There's not a strong alerting signal. In contrast, the dinner hour for most human beings, so say around 5 to 7-ish, something like that, um, is the clock is actually quite alert also. And so you might be, I sometimes say to my students, it's almost like we've prepared ourselves to be able to have a social and enjoyable dinner, even though at that hour, if you think about it, it's already getting towards the end of your day since you last slept. So they work sort of in tandem, but not entirely in tandem with each other. And the way we estimate where the clock is, right? Because we can't see the suprachiasmatic nucleus unless we went into your hypothalamus, is there are outputs of the clock. And there are two outputs that we can look at. One is core body temperature, and one is melatonin. So everyone knows basically what core body temperature is. Melatonin is a hormone. I know you all who may be listening may think of it as some melatonin gummies that you buy in the drugstore, and that's a whole nother conversation too, as to my opinion about that. Um, but melatonin is a hormone secreted by the pineal gland, and it is also a way we can estimate where we sometimes call it the hormone of darkness, where the clock is. So, for example, melatonin should, generally speaking, peaks about 30 to 45 minutes before our personal ideal time that we're likely to fall asleep based on the clock, our biological clock saying we're ready to sleep. And core body temperature troughs, it's at its lowest level around that same time. In fact, that's why sometimes we might feel a little chill close to when we're getting sleepy. That's another symptom of kind of saying maybe it's time, maybe we should be getting ready for bed. It's time to go to sleep. Often we just ignore that. Um, so that's process C and process S. We could say a lot more about it, but very important, as you know, as I know you know, Tanya, and I know you want your audience to know. There are key developmental changes to both process S and process C that are relevant for high school students.
Thank you so much, Professor. That was a very helpful and clear explanation of how sleep works. You mentioned that it would be easier to visualize this process. So, for our listeners, I've put together some diagrams to help visualize how process S and process C work together so they can actually see what it looks like. Um, An analogy that I've seen used is that of a water tank with a drain at the bottom. And the filling up of the water tank is what happens during the day, and that's associated with sleep pressure. And the drain opens up at night in response to our circadian clock, and that's when we fall asleep. And then in the response to the morning light, the drain closes again, and the water or the sleep pressure starts to fill up. So, if you listeners are wondering what exactly this water is, well, scientists aren't 100% sure, but they do have some strong clues. So, one theory is that it comes from your brain's urge to make synaptic connections, which happens the most during sleep. And another points to the chemical adenosine, which builds up as a byproduct of energy use in the brain. Um, However, the strongest evidence suggests that it is the buildup of electrons in the mitochondria of brain cells, which are these tiny powerhouses that are essentially just getting taxed the longer that you stay awake. So that's a little bit of background information about what exactly makes up sleep pressure. But really, all of it is just a fancier way of saying that the longer that we're awake, the more that this sleep tank is filling up and needs to be drained at night. So, using that sleep tank idea, Professor Wilson, how full does it actually need to get for teens each night? And what starts to happen both now and later if we don't let it refill properly?
I mean, I think the better way to think about it is we all have, depending on our age, we have a sleep need. Okay.
Right.
And for individuals in your age group, there's a lot of detail one could go into, but the general range we talk about is 8 to 10 hours, ideally around 9 hours of sleep is the sleep need. And there's actually not that much individual difference. There's a lot of things in humans where there are a lot of individual differences, but the sleep need is pretty consistent across people. There certainly are short sleepers and long sleepers, but generally speaking, the variability is not as great as many people think it is. If we don't, if we don't fill that, to use your metaphor, and we develop a sleep debt, for example, which often happens, um, we can't make that up. We can make that up in the short run. We can kind of day to day get more sleep, but we then if we don't really kind of contend with that, we continue to build a sleep debt. And insufficient sleep over a lifetime, we're starting to learn can contribute to even there's growing research suggesting it may even be associated with dementia or other health problems on the long run. So kind of paying to use your metaphor. Paying attention to understanding that filling that is very important. Like ignoring that is a problem. And if we ignore it, or we have what's called misaligned sleep, and I think we should talk a little bit about that, then there are many daytime consequences. And I think that's really what's of great concern. So, in other words, if we are getting insufficient sleep, or we have very irregular sleep-wake patterns, or we have poor quality sleep, so maybe we do a bad job of the way it's filled is not high quality sleep, um, then we are at risk for not doing well in school. We're at risk for having sleepy driver or fall asleep at the wheel motor vehicle accidents. We're more likely to get colds and have trouble getting over the flu. We actually are more likely to gain weight. Our ability to both make sense of what we learn, retain what we learn, and then produce what we learn and filter out what's not important is affected, and so on.
I see. That makes sense. So you mentioned something that I'd really love to dig into more, which is this idea of misaligned sleep. And I think a lot of students actually experience this. So what exactly is circadian misalignment?
What circadian misalignment basically is referring to when the schedule, the human-made schedule that we need to be on, so the time you have to start school or start work, whatever schedule you're on, does not match with your biological clock. Circadian misalignment is like jet lag. Shift workers and rotating shift workers have circadian misalignment, but high school students who have to start school too early in the morning relative to where the adolescent's biological clock is, we haven't really talked about that, develop what's called circadian misalignment. They're basically being forced to wake up when their body is telling them to still sleep. Um, and and you can't go in the reverse direction. So it's very hard to go to sleep earlier than your clock. We tend to continue to move in the um, um, later and later, not the other way around our natural clock. So misalignment is when our the schedule that we're on, the lifestyle that we live in, that schedule does not match up with both day, night outside and our suprachiasmatic nucleus, our actual biological clock. That's what we mean by misalignment.
I see, I see. Okay.
And so
So
teenagers have to who starts because adolescents experience what's called a circadian phase delay. That is to say that they become their natural time to fall asleep becomes later in the evening, and in turn, they're going to wake up later in the morning. And that's what makes having very early school start times very problematic because you're basically, it's like asking an adult to, start work at 3 o'clock in the morning. That's kind of, and so we refer to that as teenagers end up having what we call we call it social jet lag. So you're not actually traveling, but it's as if you're flying, it's harder to fly west to east. So it would be as if you're flying to school every day from Seattle to Baltimore.
got it. So when that misalignment shows up and teens are forced to wake up early for school, resulting in sleepiness during the day because their sleep pressure didn't drain enough the following night, would a short nap actually help, or could it make the problem worse?
So napping's a really great topic. So first of all, in terms of that process C again, or our circadian rhythms, we all have well, young children don't, but starting in adolescence, we also experience what's called a circadian trough. So in the afternoon, interestingly enough, 3 to 5, 4 to 6, somewhere in that ballpark before the dinner hour, there's a little bit of a trough where we feel more sleepy. We feel more sleepy than we do even later in the evening. And and in some societies, in some cultures, in fact, they have a siesta. It's a custom to, take a nap in the afternoon. Not too many places anymore, but for um, in terms of kind of the usefulness of a nap, a short nap, what we sometimes some people have colloquially called a power nap, if we nap for we sometimes say under 60 minutes, under 45 minutes, and we don't take that nap too close to when we're going to go to bed, um, then a nap can be alerting. It can help us get through the day. It's a natural way of, helping with alertness and wakefulness. If we sleep for too long, though, either too long, we didn't really talk about sleep stages in a journey of a night's sleep, but if we go through multiple bouts of sleep during the day, and we get both REM and non-REM sleep, or non-REM and REM sleep, then that's and or our nap is too close to our ideal time to go to sleep at night, then we're going to have trouble sleeping at night.
I see. So just make sure you're taking uh shorter naps like farther away from, when you actually go to sleep.
Correct.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then what about on the, vice versa where you're very tired, or sorry, you're not at all tired, very late at night. I know you talked about melatonin and the melatonin gummies.
Mhm.
What would that be, a reasonable tool for improving your sleep regularity or
Yes, melatonin has become a supplement in this country. We're the only country, almost one of the only countries in the world that it does not need you don't need a prescription to get melatonin. So, which is very interesting. So here in the United States, you're right, anyone can go into a health food store, a drug store, a grocery store and buy melatonin. These days you can get melatonin gummies, you can get chocolate covered melatonin. It comes in every variety. I think that it says something about the sleep deprived world that we live in, and people are often looking for a quick solution. Um, so where I stand on melatonin, particularly for your audience, I think it's important to know that Again, it's not FDA approved. Um, you need to look into if you're going to consider melatonin. Well, let me back up for a second. Let me say a little bit more. Melatonin is not a sedative. Melatonin, if it's used appropriately, and more really it's for adults than for anybody else, including high school students. It's really beneficial when you're traveling. It can help with jet lag. There may be benefits to using melatonin if you're a shift worker, because it's really helping with the process C, not really with process S. So it's shifting the clock. Now, it does do that. It functions in the short term like a sedative. You will get sleepy from it, and so people will use it as if it's a medication to help them fall asleep, but that's not really the purpose of using melatonin. Also, for people who are still developing, and you're going to have your audience may range, but for children and even younger adolescents, regularly using melatonin is not advised by the pediatric or child psychology community. We do not know the long-term ramifications. We do not know how melatonin might interfere even with physiological development during adolescence. Um, and it's not really the right solution. So if have trouble falling asleep or staying asleep, and you may have something called insomnia, then it's really important to seek treatment for insomnia. Sorry, that's my dog barking because my husband's probably coming in. Mishka, come here. Then we recommend cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, or really talking with your primary caregiver. For adolescents who who want to go to sleep earlier because they have an early school start time, the solution is really not melatonin either. The solution is lobbying your school district for later school start times, quite frankly. So we could talk a lot more about melatonin, but people really need to be more cautious than they are. We have an incredible rise in melatonin use without really knowing the ramifications.
I see. Okay. Okay, I do want to be very mindful of your time, so I just have one last question.
Sure, that's fine,
Um,
Tanya.
which
Miss, come here, come here, come here, come here. Okay, oh well.
and the last question is specifically, talking specifically about adolescence,
Mm-hmm.
which I know has been your like one of your major contributions
Mm-hmm.
to sleep science. And specifically, like you talked about earlier, the circadian phase delay.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so do you mind just going into, some of these key differences for
Yeah, yeah. So there are changes, there are developmental changes to both process C and process S. Actually, quite early on in adolescence, there's some people who argue the sleep changes may be a marker for the start of adolescence. So already by seventh grade, if not eighth grade, maybe even in some cases sixth grade, you're going to start to see some of these changes at the individual level. So with regard, I'll do process C first because I already referred to it. There's a delay in the timing of your sleep. So adolescents start to be unable to fall asleep as early as they did previously. And similarly, are going to wake up later in the morning. And the change can be anywhere from, 30 minutes to 2 hour change for some adolescents. And you can't will yourself to sleep. You're basically the window, the opportunity to sleep shifts to later in the evening. It's not just being a grumpy adolescent who doesn't want to listen to a parent about going to bed. There you can make it worse by being on your phone and your iPad and et cetera, or socializing. You can certainly then stay up even later. So that's number one. Number two, sleep need does not change. So what's really important, and it gets back to your filling of the tank, we know also that sleep need from about age 10 to about 18 remains 8 to 10 hours, with the mean as well as the median and mode being close to 9 hours, being the ideal amount of sleep to get sufficient sleep. And so that's really important to keep in mind when we think about process S. And then the other really key change is that sleep pressure builds more slowly. So what does that mean? Basically, it means that we can almost mask, we can, adolescents will not experience being or feeling that pressure to sleep as readily as someone who is younger and considerably older than they are. So in other words, the pressure is building more slowly, but they still need the 8 to 10 hours of sleep. Um, and so those changes, those really striking changes, again, fairly early in adolescence, make really create kind of what we've come to call, my colleagues and I, the perfect storm, because you have schools starting too early in many, many parts of the country and around the world. And so have this circadian misalignment that I referred to earlier, yet you still need this important amount of sleep around 9 hours. And so this kind of cone or opportunity to sleep gets more and more narrow, is both ill aligned, and it gets more narrow. And that then creates all these daytime consequences that I talked about earlier. Unless we
I
do something about changing school start times.
I see. And it's even worse because on top of this perfect storm, teens also come back from school and most of them have, sports or clubs, or music, volunteering, and maybe even a job, and then a pile of homework waiting, at home. And then for a lot of teens, this homework doesn't even start until maybe 8 or 9 p.m. And on top of that, since a lot of homework and work happens on screen, you're staring into this bright light late at night when your brain should actually be, starting to get ready for bedtime, which means that your melatonin doesn't rise as much, and your circadian rhythm is pushed later, which makes it even more difficult for, a student to fall asleep at the appropriate time. Professor Wolfson, this has been incredibly eye-opening. You've given us the science behind why teen sleep is so challenging. And you explained the two-process model and circadian misalignment, and the realities of melatonin. And it was all such a clear and helpful explanation that I'm sure my listeners are incredibly grateful for, and I know I am. And so, on behalf of myself and my listeners, thank you so, so much for making the time to have this conversation and for also all your decades of research and for helping launch the first episode of my podcast. So it means a lot to me. So thank you so much.
My
So much.
pleasure, and I'm happy to come back again.
I would love that.
Okay. All right. Well,
Thank you so much.
it's not so late, but good evening to everyone, and I hope later tonight you sleep well. Okay.
I hope so too.
Okay.
Good
Bye-bye.
night.
Bye-bye.
So now that Professor Wilson has provided some information about, why it's so hard for teens to fall asleep at night, I want to talk about what you can actually do with this information and how you can use it to actually improve your ability to fall asleep. So, the first thing that you really want to try and do is wind down before bed. So this means kind of giving your brain like a little bit of a runway, to land, which means wrapping up the homework and intense studying at least 30 to 60 minutes, before the time that you actually want to be asleep. So you can use this to, read or journal or listen to music. And in that way, you're not actually just wasting your time, but you can still, use it up. Just try and do calmer activities. And as for screens, I know it's very hard to stop using them, but if you can, as early as possible, um, or at least turn on night mode such as sepia. Um, it would be very helpful to help wind down your brain because your brain is seeing this blue light and interpreting it as daylight, which means that it's not releasing the melatonin because it thinks that it's still um, the daytime and it's not time for your brain to actually be asleep. So, the next thing I want to talk about is caffeine. And the problem is that I know a lot of teens love to drink coffee and love to have a caffeinated drink once in a while. But what's actually happening inside your brain is that all day long, this chemical called adenosine is building up. And the more you have, the sleepier you can feel. But the problem is that caffeine doesn't actually remove the adenosine. It just blocks that signal. And your brain thinks that it's not tired, even though the drowsiness is still there underneath. So short term, that feels great, and you're able to be wired and focused. But the problem is that you're less sleepy at bedtime. So that you end up going to bed later and get less total sleep. And then the next day, your memory and attention and problem solving are actually worse than if you just slept. So when you try to sacrifice sleep and drink caffeine, you're actually obstructing your learning system from both sides because less sleep means that your brain doesn't properly store what you're studying if you're using caffeine to study. And this caffeine also pushes your sleep later too. So not only are you not actually retaining the um, information that you studied, but you're also just confusing your brain and making it think that your bedtime's later than it should be and that you're not tired yet. Now, the third thing I want to talk about is weekends, because this is actually where a lot of teen sleep schedules fall apart. Because typically during the school week, you're surviving on very little sleep, but you decide that it's okay because you can just make up for that sleep debt during the weekend, which sounds reasonable, but the problem is that your circadian rhythm loves consistency. So when you sleep in 3 or 4 hours later than usual, your clock goes, oh, I guess we live in a new time zone. And that's what a lot of researchers call this social jet lag or circadian misalignment, where you didn't get on a plane but your schedule jumped a few time zones. So when you stay up really late on, Friday and Saturday and you wake up very late, then Sunday night your circadian rhythm and your sleep schedule is misaligned and you actually should be going to sleep at 10:30, but you're not used to it. So you end up going to sleep much, much later. So that doesn't mean that you cannot sleep in. It just means that you want your schedule a little bit more similar to your school day schedule. So if you can only try to shift it by 1 or 2 hours in the weekend, then that would be fine. The main problem is just over exaggerating it and sleeping for 4 or 5 hours more, which really confuses your brain.